This story doesn't begin with shouting, accusations, or a dramatic face-off in a confession chair. It doesn't start with an explosive family meeting, a slammed door, or a headline screaming, "Breaking." It begins with something far more terrifying for a man like Kody Brown. A calm sentence spoken with certainty. No theatrics, no crying, no begging. Just a truth, delivered so quietly that it doesn't sound like revenge. It sounds like closure. David doesn't just visit, he stays. 6 words, that's it. And yet those 6 words carry the weight of an entire decade of disappointment. Because when a child says something like that, it doesn't land like gossip. It doesn't land like a petty jab. It lands like a verdict, a final, silent ruling that can't be appealed. You can argue with a spouse, you can blame a wife, you can accuse an ex of turning the kids against you. But when the youngest child, especially the one who stayed quiet, the one who never led a rebellion, the one who never made noise, says something, that final one, it exposes something deeper than broken relationships. It exposes the fact that a title doesn't guarantee love. For years, Kody Brown built his identity on the idea that he was the center of this family system, the head, the leader. The man who could stretch his attention across multiple households and still be seen as the father figure everyone would respect. Even when the marriages began to crumble, even when wives started leaving, even when the older kids grew distant, there was still a belief, at least in Kody's mind, that the youngest would always remain emotionally available, that the youngest would always be the safe place, the last door still open, the last person who would never truly turn. But here's the thing about control. It looks powerful until someone stops responding to it. And this isn't a story about a teenager lashing out for attention. This isn't teen attitude. This is something colder, and in a way, more heartbreaking. It's a child who has quietly watched every promise crumble and has finally stopped waiting for repair. When a child reaches that point, it isn't impulsive, it's calculated. Not malicious, not dramatic, just done. That's why those words hit like a punch. Because David doesn't just visit, he stays, isn't really about David. It's about contrast. It's about the difference between a man who shows up in fragments and a man who shows up consistently. It's about the difference between someone who talks about loyalty and someone who earns it. For over a decade, the Brown family's public image was built on an idea that love could be multiplied, that family could be stretched, that unity could exist even when time, attention, and affection were divided. But the show also revealed a darker truth as the years went on, because love doesn't just need good intentions. Love needs presence, it needs repetition, it needs proof, and presence is the one currency Kody stopped paying out equally. The tragedy here is that the collapse didn't happen in one big moment. It happened in slow motion. In missed visits that turned into fewer calls, in promises that became excuses, in next week that quietly turned into maybe, in the kind of absence that isn't loud enough to be labeled abandonment at first until you look back and realize the pattern was always there. That's what makes Truly such a powerful symbol in this story. Truly was never the headline maker. She wasn't the one screaming in family meetings. She wasn't the one publicly calling anyone out. She was the kid viewers often saw in the background, quietly present, quietly observing, quietly surviving in the shadow of everyone else's chaos. And that's why it feels so chilling that she's the one who delivers the line that finally ends the illusion. Because if Truly has reached the "I'm done waiting" stage, then the last thread has snapped. When the quote leaked, fans didn't want to believe it at first, not because it seemed impossible, but because it felt too final, too clean, too perfectly symbolic. But then the timeline starts replaying in people's minds, and suddenly the sentence doesn't feel like a shock, it feels like a conclusion. Truly is old enough now to understand patterns, old enough to recognize who shows up when it's convenient and who shows up when it's necessary, old enough to realize the difference between love that performs and love that stays. Old enough to see that the head of the family image only holds power when the family believes in it. And that belief, it's fading. That's why those 6 words don't just wound Kody, they threaten the core of his identity. Because his entire narrative has always depended on being seen as the father, the leader, the center. Even when wives left, even when kids pulled away, there was always this sense that he could still claim his role. He could still say, "I'm the dad." He could still demand the respect that comes with that title. But here's the brutal truth. Parenthood doesn't survive on titles. It survives on presence. That's what David doesn't just visit. "he stays" really means. It means one man walked in and did something Kody stopped doing. Not grand gestures, not speeches, not rules, just consistency. The boring, simple, powerful act of staying. And in that contrast, everything collapses. Because if a child feels safer with a man who isn't her biological father because he stays, then what does that say about the man who built his entire legacy on being the father? It says the empire wasn't taken. It was abandoned. And now the illusion of the Brown family, the idea that Kody could hold everyone's loyalty just by being the head, finally breaks under the weight of one calm sentence. Not screamed, not tweeted, not used as a weapon, just spoken like truth. And that's what makes it the most devastating line of all. Truly was never the loud one. She wasn't the child demanding attention, interrupting conversations, or competing for space in a crowded room. While arguments filled the house and adults fought for control, Truly learned something far more important than how to speak. She learned how to watch. In a family where emotions were always on display, her silence became her shield. She sat on the edges of conversations, half hidden behind sibling, clutching a book or a toy, absorbing everything. And what she absorbed wasn't chaos, it was information. She learned patterns, she learned rhythms, she learned who mattered in which moments, and who disappeared when things became inconvenient. Very early on, she began to notice things children aren't supposed to have to notice. Who arrived when the cameras were on, who disappeared when the doors closed, who said, "I love you," and who actually proved it. Her silence wasn't a lack of personality. It wasn't shyness. It wasn't emotional immaturity. It was self-protection. In an environment where attention was inconsistent and affection came with conditions, being quiet was safer than being hopeful. When you don't expect much, disappointment hurts less, and Truly learned that lesson far too young. As a child, she adapted to instability by lowering her expectations, not because she didn't care, but because caring openly had consequences. Independence wasn't confidence, it was survival. It was learning to sit with yourself, to self-soothe, to stop waiting for someone else to notice you. That's the kind of independence adults often praise without realizing what it costs a child. Fans didn't notice it at first. On the surface, Truly seemed fine. She wasn't acting out. She wasn't angry. She wasn't confrontational. And in families like this, those are often the children who slip through the cracks, the ones who don't cause problems, the ones who don't demand explanations, the ones who quietly adapt while everyone else argues. But when viewers look back now, the signs are impossible to ignore. The stiff posture when her father entered the room, the careful expressions, always measured, always controlled. The way she didn't rush toward him the way younger children usually do. The absence of spontaneous affection, no jumping hugs, no unfiltered excitement. Children don't stop reaching for their parents without reason. They stop reaching when reaching hurts. And the pain isn't always dramatic. It's not always marked by screaming or tears. Sometimes it's a series of small disappointments stacked so high that the child simply gives up trying. Each missed moment teaches a lesson. Each broken promise rewires expectation. Each absence becomes part of a quiet, emotional equation. Truly learned early that hoping came with risk, so she watched instead. She watched how her father moved between houses like a guest instead of a constant. She watched her mother hold everything together while absorbing the emotional weight alone. She watched adults argue about fairness while she learned that fairness didn't guarantee presence. And most importantly, she watched who stayed when things weren't easy. Her quiet became her armor. That's why the shift was so noticeable when Christine remarried. For the first time, Truly didn't look like a child bracing herself for disappointment. Something in her body language changed. Her shoulders relaxed. Her face softened. Her laughter didn't sound polite or cautious. It sounded real. And that difference stunned people, because it didn't come from a dramatic event or a grand gesture. It came from safety. Safety looks different than happiness. Happiness can be loud. Safety is calm. Safety is knowing that someone will still be there tomorrow. Safety is not having to measure your words or your emotions. And for the first time, Truly seemed to be experiencing that. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was resting. Contrast was subtle but powerful. Around chaos, she had learned to shrink. Around consistency, she began to expand. And that expansion didn't happen because anyone told her to trust. It happened because trust was finally earned. Children like Truly don't announce when they're healing. They don't give speeches. They don't perform their growth. They simply begin to take up more space. They make eye contact. They smile without checking the room first. They lean into moments instead of standing on the edge of them. That's what viewers started to notice. The quiet child wasn't gone, but she was no longer hiding. And that's when it became clear that her silence had never been emptiness. It had been awareness. She was always listening, always observing, always learning the difference between words and actions. So when she eventually spoke, when she finally said something that ended an era, it didn't come from impulse. It came from years of careful watching, years of emotional data, years of understanding exactly what presence feels like, and exactly what absence does to a child. Truly didn't change suddenly. The environment changed. And when the environment became safe, the child who had been surviving finally had the space to tell the truth, quietly, clearly, and without regret. Truly was born into fracture long before anyone was ready to admit it. Her first breath didn't arrive in a moment of unity or calm. It arrived during a season when the family was already splitting at the seams, when attention was divided, when loyalty was quietly being redirected. Christine went into labor while Kody was physically present, but emotionally elsewhere, distracted, preoccupied, already prioritizing another relationship. That absence didn't begin later, during arguments or separations. It began at birth. A newborn doesn't understand words, but they understand presence. They understand tone, warmth, focus. They feel whether the room is grounded or unstable. And truly entered the world surrounded by noise, chaos, and emotional distance. What should have been a moment of bonding became the first signal of disconnection. Christine felt it immediately, even if she didn't yet have language for it. The joy of bringing new life into the family was shadowed by the realization that she was already doing it alone. And that fracture only deepened. The defining moment, the one that rewired everything, came years later, when Truly's kidneys began to fail. At first, it didn't look catastrophic. She was tired, quiet, slower than usual. Children get sick all the time, and in a family this large exhaustion often blended into the background. But something was wrong. Very wrong. Her body was shutting down. Severe dehydration had pushed her into acute kidney failure. Her organs were failing silently, and no one noticed in time. She was under Kody's watch. Christine had trusted him. She had left for a short trip, believing the basics would be handled, that her daughter would be fed, monitored, protected. Instead, when Christine returned, she found a child in crisis. Truly's eyes were unfocused. Her breathing was shallow. She couldn't stand. Panic ripped through Christine as she rushed her daughter to the hospital, realizing just how close she had come to losing her. Doctors were blunt. This was preventable. Those words don't just describe a medical reality, they describe a betrayal. Preventable means someone should have noticed. Preventable means someone should have stayed attentive. Preventable means this didn't have to happen. That day did something irreversible. Yes, Truly's body healed, but her trust didn't. Children remember trauma differently than adults. They don't always remember dates or diagnoses, but they remember sensations. They remember fear. They remember who held their hand, who stayed through the night, who whispered comfort when the world felt dangerous. Truly remembers. She remembers the hospital bed. She remembers the uncertainty. She remembers her mother never leaving her side. And she remembers who didn't show up in the way she needed. When Kody arrived, the focus shifted quickly, not to accountability, not to repair, but to his own emotional experience. He spoke about how hard it was for him, how scary it was for him. The language centered his stress, his fear, his shock. Empathy for his daughter's suffering was muted, secondary, almost performative. That moment quietly rewired something inside, truly. Because a child learns very quickly who is safe in crisis, who becomes smaller when things get hard, and who becomes solid. Christine became the constant, the anchor, the one who stayed awake, who whispered reassurances, who fought for her child's life without distraction. Kody, meanwhile, became unreliable. Not because he didn't care at all, but because care without presence doesn't register as protection to a child. And from that moment on, Truly stopped believing her father would come through when it mattered most. He didn't become a villain in her mind. He became something worse. He became a visitor. And visitors don't protect you when your world collapses. After the hospital, something shifted in Truly's behavior. She didn't regress loudly. She didn't act out. She adapted. She lowered her expectations even further. She stopped assuming adults would notice her needs. She stopped hoping someone would intervene before things got bad. She learned to rely on herself emotionally. because relying on him had proven dangerous. That hospital bed became her first real lesson in survival. It taught her that emergencies reveal truth, that when things get dark, you learn who stays. And she learned, at a painfully young age, that her father's presence wasn't guaranteed even when her life was on the line. From that point forward, every interaction was filtered through that memory. Missed moments weren't isolated incidents anymore. They were confirmation. Every time he showed up distracted, every time he talked about fairness instead of connection, every time his stress outweighed her feelings, the pattern reinforced itself. And the most tragic part is this: Kody never seemed to understand that this was the moment everything changed. He spoke about the kidney failure as a scary chapter the family survived. But for Truly, it wasn't a chapter. It was a turning point. The day she learned that love spoken aloud doesn't always equal protection in practice. You can forgive arguments. You can forgive distance, but a child never forgets who failed them when they were most vulnerable. From that day on, Truly didn't expect her father to protect her. She adjusted her world accordingly. And once a child makes that adjustment, the relationship never fully recovers, because trust, once broken at that level, doesn't regenerate on its own. It requires presence, consistency, and accountability. And none of those came fast enough. So Kody became a visitor not because someone pushed him out, but because when it mattered most, he wasn't truly there. And that memory stayed with her, quietly, permanently. There are moments in childhood that don't look dramatic in the moment, but they quietly rewrite everything. The pandemic driveway scene was one of those moments. It didn't involve yelling. It didn't involve confrontation. It involved something far more devastating: a child reaching out and being refused. Truly stood outside beside her mother, small and hopeful, after weeks of separation. She hadn't seen her father in a long time. There was no plan, no agenda. She simply opened her arms for a hug, a natural instinct, a reflex built into every child who still believes a parent will catch them. Kody stepped back. He didn't kneel down. He didn't open his arms. He didn't soften his voice. He cited rules, safety, protocol, risk. The camera caught the moment her arms slowly fell back to her sides. No tears, no protest, just confusion flickering across her face before it disappeared. She nodded, as if she understood. But understanding wasn't what happened in that moment. Learning was, because days later, the footage told a different story. Viewers watched Kody inside Robyn's house, hugging her children freely, sitting close, laughing, touching shoulders, acting like the same risk suddenly no longer existed. The internet replayed those scenes side by side, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. But the most important viewer wasn't online. It was Truly. Children notice inconsistency faster than adults. They don't analyze it, they absorb it. And the lesson she learned that day was devastatingly clear. Love had conditions. Rules weren't universal. Affection depended on location, and loyalty determined access. That was the moment her father's love stopped feeling unconditional. From that point on, every interaction was filtered through that realization. The pandemic didn't create distance, it exposed it. It made visible what had always been true but easier to ignore: that closeness was selective, and she wasn't on the favored side of the equation. And then there was the bike scene. What should have been one of those warm, forgettable childhood milestones became another lesson in control. Truly wanted to learn to ride her bike. She was excited but nervous, exactly how children are supposed to feel. Christine set the tone gently, encouraging her, ready to celebrate effort, not perfection. Then Kody stepped in. He took over the moment with confidence and impatience. His voice sharpened. His instructions came faster. His frustration surfaced every time. Truly hesitated. What should have been encouragement turned into pressure. What should have been patience turned into performance. You need to toughen up. It sounded small, casual, almost throwaway. But that sentence carried a dangerous message. Vulnerability was unacceptable. Fear was failure. And love could be withheld if she didn't perform correctly. Truly's body language changed instantly. Her shoulders tightened. Her hands shook on the handlebars. Each fall felt heavier than the last, not because of the scrapes, but because of the disappointment waiting for her when she looked up. She wasn't just learning to balance a bike, she was learning to measure herself against someone else's expectations, and she couldn't meet them. What hurt most wasn't the tone. It was the absence of empathy. She looked back for reassurance and didn't find it. Christine tried to step in, to soften the moment, to remind her that fear was normal. But Kody brushed it off. The lesson continued. That scene became a blueprint, not just for that afternoon, but for how love worked in that relationship. Approval had to be earned. Comfort came second. Obedience mattered more than emotional safety. And children internalized those lessons deeply. From that moment forward, Truly stopped asking. She stopped expecting encouragement. She stopped reaching for reassurance. Because every time she reached and didn't receive it, it reinforced the same truth. Needing too much would only lead to disappointment. The silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was understanding. Understanding that affection wasn't freely given. Understanding that mistakes weren't safe. Understanding that love could be withdrawn if she didn't comply. And when a child reaches that level of understanding, something shifts permanently. They stop initiating. They stop hoping. They stop extending themselves emotionally because the cost has become too high. That's why the later distance didn't come with anger. It came with detachment. Detachment is what happens when a child realizes that self-protection is safer than connection, when the risk of being hurt outweighs the possibility of being loved. The driveway rejection and the bike lesson weren't isolated incidents. They were confirmation. Confirmation that her father's love came with terms and conditions. And children can live with many things: chaos, instability, even disappointment, but they cannot thrive under conditional love. That day in the driveway was the last time she reached forward instinctively. The bike scene was the moment she learned why she shouldn't. From then on, she conserved her energy. She stopped offering vulnerability to someone who couldn't handle it. She learned that staying quiet was safer than hoping for warmth that might never come. And that understanding stayed with her, quietly, firmly, until the day she finally spoke, not in anger, but in clarity. Because once a child stops reaching, it's not a phase, it's a decision. And by the time those 6 words were spoken, that decision had already been made. David Woolley didn't arrive like a savior. There was no dramatic entrance, no declaration of authority, no attempt to replace anyone. He didn't demand loyalty, didn't insist on being seen, didn't try to rewrite the past. In a family that had been exhausted by speeches, rules, and emotional negotiations, his presence was almost shocking because of how quiet it was. He simply stayed. And for a child who had spent her entire life measuring love in fragments, staying meant everything. David showed up in ordinary ways, the kind of ways cameras rarely linger on because they don't look dramatic. He sat at the dinner table. He listened without interrupting. He noticed when someone was quiet. He remembered details. He followed through. He was there tomorrow in the same way he was there today. That kind of consistency doesn't feel impressive to adults who grew up with it. But to a child who learned early that presence was temporary, it feels revolutionary. For truly, healing didn't come from therapy sessions or long conversations about the past. It came from repetition. From the slow realization that she didn't have to brace herself for disappointment anymore, that she didn't have to earn affection, that she didn't have to perform to stay connected. Consistency is what healed her. Around David, her body language changed before her words ever did. Her shoulders softened. Her laughter came more easily. She leaned in instead of standing back. These weren't conscious choices. They were nervous system responses. Her body was responding to safety, something it had rarely known. David didn't try to parent through control. He didn't confuse authority with dominance. He didn't equate love with obedience. He gave her space without abandonment and attention without pressure. And in doing so, he offered something she had never truly had before: a stable, emotional environment. That's why the 6 words didn't come out in a burst of anger or frustration. They came quietly, during an ordinary evening in Utah. No cameras, no producers, no performance. Just a moment of calm honesty between sisters. David doesn't just visit, he stays. Those words weren't cruel. They weren't meant to wound. They weren't spoken to punish anyone. They were simply true. And that truth marked the moment Truly stopped waiting. Waiting for apologies that never came. Waiting for consistency that never lasted. Waiting for a father to become something he had already shown her he wouldn't be. In that moment, she didn't choose David over Kody. She chose peace over uncertainty. That distinction matters, because this wasn't rebellion. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't a child being turned against a parent. It was closure, the quiet kind that doesn't slam doors but locks them anyway. Kody lost something that night that he can't control, spin, or reclaim. He lost his youngest daughter's faith in him, not her anger, not her respect, her belief. Belief is the most fragile currency in any relationship. And once it's gone, No amount of authority can bring it back. Kody could argue with wives. He could dismiss criticism. He could rewrite narratives. But he could not argue with a child's lived experience. And that's what made this moment final. The Brown family didn't fall because of divorce papers or legal separations. It didn't collapse because one wife left or another followed. It fell because love without presence doesn't survive, because titles without consistency don't hold, because control without care eventually empties out. For years, the image of the Brown family was built on the idea that unity could be maintained through structure and hierarchy, that being the head meant the rest would follow. But families don't function like empires. They function like ecosystems. When the foundation erodes, everything above it weakens slowly, quietly, inevitably. And in the end, it wasn't a wife who delivered the final blow to that illusion. It was the quietest child, the one who didn't shout, the one who didn't accuse, the one who simply observed, learned, and chose differently. Truly didn't destroy the Brown family. She revealed what had already been broken. Her story isn't tragic because she walked away. It's powerful because she found peace. Christine's victory isn't loud either. It's visible in the calm of her home, in the laughter around her table, in the absence of fear in her children's eyes. It's the relief of no longer fighting for love that has to be negotiated. It's renewal, not revenge, and truly stands at the center of that renewal, no longer shrinking, no longer waiting, no longer measuring herself against someone else's conditions. She doesn't need to explain her choice. Her peace explains it for her. Kody, meanwhile, is left with echoes. The family he once ruled no longer revolves around him. The loyalty he assumed would always exist has dissolved into distance. And the cruel irony is this: the more he tried to control the story, the more irrelevant he became. Because in the end, love doesn't answer to power. It answers to presence. And the man who stayed won not by taking anything away, but by being there long enough for a child to finally feel safe. That's the final truth of this story. Not shouted, not dramatized, just quietly lived. And sometimes, that's the loudest ending of all.